evening. How are you? Good evening. How are you? Good, good. I'm good. It's good to see you all here. I would like to thank the Film Society and John and Erica for once again inviting me to be a part of stuff that I really love. So I'm not going to do a whole lot of talking right now. I'll talk after Antebellum. But I just want to give you a little bit of background on why I'm here. So one of the things that I study is popular culture and the ways in which popular culture kind of give us some idea about what's happening in our society and how they present messaging to us about what's happening. Even though we don't necessarily pay attention, because sometimes we just kind of passively consume popular culture, the messages are always there. And when we're talking about horror, there's all different types of horror. I mean, horror is a genre in and of itself, but there are all different types of horror genre. There are all different types of horror in the horror genre, right? There is the religious horror, there's psychological horror, there is body horror, there is violence horror, and now tonight what we're going to be talking about are the ways that race is infused in horror, in the horror genre, specifically throughout these two films. Horror has always been one of those ways in which we could talk about race and ethnicity and the ways in which we act and interact around those things in our society. It has been in the most recent years, though, but probably since Get Out was released, that we've seen a real focus on it, right? That is upfront and that is unapologetic about its messaging. We've always had this kind of strain going through film, especially film that was done by Black filmmakers, but when Get Out was made, I think it's just the timing, right? What was going on in our society. It was received in a way that we've never seen race horror received in the mainstream culture before. So Antebellum is one of those films. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to watch Antebellum, which is a film that is clearly in the race horror category. But then we're going to see Ganja Hess, and the audience changes a bit, right, for each one of these. Antebellum was released in 2020, and it stars Janelle Monáe, who is a singer, actor. Well, she does just about everything. So after the film is screened, I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about it. Once again, thank you all for being here. One of the reasons that it's important to talk about horror and the intersections of horror and race is because sometimes the things that some audiences think of as scary is very different than what other audiences may think of as scary. And while we've always had discussions about race and horror, it's only been in the last few years that we have seen a pointed emergence of these kinds of themes in media. Now watch. Oh, it did work. Okay, so tonight, as we talk about this, because I am going to encourage you to talk with me about it. Remember this, you just saw a movie with adult themes, strong language. Now, what I'm saying here is that yes, these themes are inherent in the film, but they are also inherent in me, just so you know. That means there'll be some cursing. You know that the content is upsetting from the film, but also talking about it can also be upsetting. And one of the reasons I say this is because it is really important for us to have some of the conversations that we're having around these films, even when those conversations are upsetting. Okay? And so, as we are talking about these things, and as you continue to watch other pieces of media that are racecraft, it's important that you take care of yourself. So, for instance, I don't watch a lot of these films or television shows, et cetera, back to back. I just don't. It's a lot of trauma. Even if it's fictional, it's still trauma because much of the fiction is rooted in reality, okay? So, sometimes it's okay to look away, but the thing that it is most important to do is not to deny the fact that these films are based in very real circumstances. Some of them are historical, but some of them are modern. Okay? All right. So I'm going to go through a series of questions. All right. So first, what is horror? When we're talking about race horror, let's first talk about the foundation of it, this genre. Okay? This is the description. So it focuses on fear. Right? What horror does best is make us scared. Sometimes that might be a jump scare, you know, something happens that, you know, startles a person, but sometimes it's existential fear. Sometimes it's fear of a cultural or historical event. So the characteristics of horror, and this is horror genre whether we're talking about literature or film or television or music, etc. The first is foreshadowing. You always kind of get an idea about what's coming. What was your first taste of foreshadowing in this film? That wasn't rhetorical, I'm actually asking. Okay. First? Yes. Kind of ominous, right? My first was the nose ring. The woman in the green dress, and you know, at the end of the tracking shot that's, you know, trying to run away, she had a nose ring. And I was like, what the, no, right? So that was my first bit that something was wrong. Next is fear, right? There's also suspense. What's going to happen? Mystery. Why is this happening? We're trying to figure it out. And then imagination. The imagination is not just about the story itself. It's also about how the characters move through it. Okay? So, let's talk about this. What is race, right? So, here's the thing that people don't really think a whole heck of a lot about when we are talking about race. And it's mostly because this is not the discussion that we have. Race, this idea of race in any culture is socially constructed. It is socially constructed. What we like to do is talk about race in terms of biology. And that has some connection, right? Some people's bodies produce more melanin than others, right? But, and features are different. But what's most important about this concept is that we make it up in our culture. And we make it up in various ways. And then in our social interactions, we act upon it, right? We act as if these things are real. So we've got biological characteristics that people I can identify you as X. I can identify you as Y. But what's most important is this concept, ethnicity, right? Because it's culture. People's languages and behaviors and values and norms, etc., that really make up a person's identity, not their quote-unquote biology. Biology is not quote-unquote, I'm sorry. Their quote-unquote race, okay? So now what we know about is this concept of racecraft. This is the intersection of discussions about race in the horror genre. And what racecraft, the term racecraft comes from this text, which is not about horror at all. It's really about the myth of the post-racial society, but John Jennings, the person who came up with the term racecraft, is a fan of horror, specifically Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, for those of you who don't know, was a science fiction writer, science fiction slash fantasy writer who was quite prolific and also quite racist. He was a world-class bigot. And so we knew this very early on in his career. However, his work is classic science fiction. It's classic horror. And so it's hard to just kind of toss it out because the dude was racist. Because a lot of science fiction and horror themes, tropes, etc., are based on his work. So what John Jennings did was he took the discussions about race, right? And specifically about how we construct race, and he intersected this analysis and discussion with the Lovecraftian themes and tropes, right? So what we see is in Antebellum is kind of this intersection of race horror with Lovecraft types of themes. Critical race theory, and I know you all you cannot possibly have gotten through any of the last few months without hearing this term. So critical race theory is the boogeyman right now, and all critical race theory does is talk about the ways in which we have constructed race through our systems. A lot of times when people talk about it, they talk about it in terms of it being taught at law school. Yes, it is absolutely taught at law school, but it's also taught in graduate level programs. It's even taught in undergrad. When I was teaching sociological theory, that was one of the theories, because what it does is it talks about the ways in which your society constructs race through systems, right? So, for instance, people who are indigenous, all right, people who are Native American and indigenous in the United States literally have to have their names on a roll. You have to be enrolled in a tribe. That is, you have to be identified by the government as a person who is indigenous in order to get any kind of benefits that are associated with indigenous life, right? That is a construction. And that's one of the things that critical race theory talks about. Talks about, for instance, the fact that the Constitution has a whole lot of stuff in it, right, that is legally designed to oppress people. Let's remember, slavery was completely legal, and everything that was attached to it was legal. Not only was it a social construct, it was an economic construct, it was a religious construct, and on and on and on. That's what critical race theory is, and it's important to the discussion of racecraft. All right, so why is there a difference between horror and race horror? Well, one of the reasons, well, there are a few actually, but this is my daughter, and she's a horror fan, just like I am. She got it from her mama. Her daddy is not. My husband does not do. He's not here tonight because he's like, I love you, but but she thinks about the horror genre very differently than I did when I was her age. So early on, well, so she was introduced to kind of horror type stuff through Charmed, the first Charmed, right? So that was her introduction into science fiction, fantasy, magic, horror kinds of stuff. So then she moved on to films. Well, when she moved on to film, something really strange happened. She found them hilarious. Movies like Insidious and other types of horror films that were based in religion, hilarious, like crying hilarious. And she would go with her friends and watch these films, and she would be laughing, and they'd be like, what the fuck is this? Why are you laughing? That's not funny, right? And I could not figure it out until one day I remembered that she was not raised in the church. So, while most of her friends are Catholic, right? So, a kid who's possessed, come on now, right? To her, the whole thing is just absurd, right? But stuff like this, stuff like Antebellum, she doesn't like, right? That's the stuff that's scary to her, because that's the stuff that's real. So there is a generational shift in the ways in which we see horror, and especially horror at the intersection of race. It's completely different for her than it was for me, right? Okay, so why is there a difference, right? Because, Amityville Horror, white people won't get out the haunted house, right? White people don't run when the creepy white children, right? Remember when the kid got on the elevator, right? White people won't get out the house when the threat is coming from inside the house, right? And white people don't run fast enough when the dude with, the knife comes after them. And there have been, comedians have made a lot of hay about this, right? Comedians talk about this all the time. And black comedians talk about the fact that, there's a really, it's an Eddie Murphy, I can't remember which one it is, but which comedy show it is, but he says, first time somebody says, get out, like white people would be in the house, black people would be gone, right? And it's funny, but one of the reasons it's funny is because there is a large amount of cultural truth to it. People who are at the receiving end of oppression know when danger exists because they always have to be on guard for it. Excuse me. I think, no, it's the one where he had on the red, Delirious? Delirious, it's Delirious. Okay, so here's why Racecraft makes a difference here. Because there are real threats, all right? Trail of Tears. We have to have a whole movement to say to, 70% of our population that 13% of the population, their lives matter, right? Japanese internment, the internment of Japanese citizens, right, during World War II, and today, children in cages. So, while you may have been watching Antebellum thinking, okay, come on now, right? Look at this last one, right? It's real. And so the ways in which people who have been marginalized see horror are completely different, and they're almost always rooted in a further devolving of rights, of access to resources, of equity, of freedom, okay? So, fright is cultural. And this guy, I think, kind of encapsulates it for most of us, right? So listen, if there really were ghosts, given the history of the stuff, that's just 4 things that are on that previous slide, right? This is probably real. And so when we think about horror in this way, and we think about the horror genre in this way, you kind of begin to understand why specific audiences think about horror in different ways. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking and ask you if you have any questions or anything that you want to talk about with Antebellum. Anything that struck you? Oh, go ahead. Okay, it was more about power. How so? Right. 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 Until she acquiesced. It was absolutely about power. Because I do think that you're right about not only power, but I think it's an allegory for a whole bunch of different things. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Anyone else? the thing that's important about this film, I think, because it's a little ham-handed, right? But what I think the thing that's important about it is its audience. Okay, so on the one hand, the audience is, you know, this needs to be for people who don't understand that these power dynamics are still in play in our society, right? So there's those people who are supposed to, at whom this is aimed. But there are also people who question history, and this is aimed at them as well. I have very rarely been in groups of people for any extended period of time, especially marginalized folks, and not had someone say, you know, if I was X during X time, I would have done something. I would have done something else, right? The thing when Kanye was talking about he wouldn't have been a slave, yes, the fuck you would have, you know, and you would have shut the fuck up and tried to get through it just like the rest of us, right? But there's always that person in one of these groups who said, I wouldn't have been on the Trail of Tears. I wouldn't have, okay, you would have been or you would have been dead, right? So the idea that somehow in the modern era, what people went through in other historical eras, you could have handled better, is part of what the messaging is here in this film. The other thing I think about a lot when we do race horror is what is happening with the people who are making these pieces of film or television or whatever. I just don't know how, well, I just think it would be really difficult to do. And one of the things that we're learning from productions in the more recent history is that a lot of the filmmakers are thinking about that same thing. Now, when people are making these kinds of films, there are counselors and therapists on set, right, to help people deal with, you know, the creation of this kind of art. Okay? All right. Any questions about it? Any thoughts? Any? Yes, in the back. Go ahead. The cocoon and the, yeah, and the, right. And I felt like it was overused in the imagery of the film because I don't think that I think she escaped, but I don't think she turned it into anything different. I think she was strong when she went in, and I think she was strong when she came out. So I didn't quite understand that. I didn't. I thought it would have been better. So here's, you know, if somebody were to ask me, I think that it would have been better if it were a moth. Because moths are actually scary. And they fly all over the place, and they're kind of ugly, and they're big. And I kind of felt like a moth would have been a better representation of what happened to her and everybody else there. So I wasn't all that impressed with the butterfly imagery. You know, the only exception to that, well, I mean, I understood the connection between the butterfly, because the woman who hung herself, the tattoo, had the tattoo. But beyond that, I thought it was kind of wasted. Yeah, I did. She was. Yeah, she was, but it didn't, I don't feel like it gave that kind, we didn't get a through line. We didn't get the kind of through line that I thought that we should with the butterfly. It just kind of hung there. Oh, I'm sorry. That was not, it was just kind of there. You're right. They would have. And maybe that's where I got the idea from. But I think you're absolutely right. But in the back. Well, see, but I think that's perhaps the difference in a person who's actually doing the reenactment and people who are driving around the street with with the battle flag on their cars, right? One of them knows what they're talking about. The other is using symbolic reference to bigotry, right? And so, and I think that that's the difference. Now, having said that, I do know that about the reenactors. I do, but it just makes me uneasy. It, yes, it because because I'm like, of all the things to reenact, y'all. Yeah. No, I get it. I understand. I'm just talking about from my perspective. Like, I'm not interested in going to Confederate sites, things like that. I'm just not. I just, because in many instances, I feel like the people who are driving around with the stuff on their truck, that they think that what you're doing as a historian legitimates what they're doing as a bigot. Yeah. No, I think that for most people, that's why they're doing it. Because, if you want to talk about war if you want to talk about the justification for war, then perhaps there was no greater reason, right, to do it. I do understand that, but I just don't think that most people think of it that way. Yeah. Well, but you can't accept that what we know about how people act and interact based on race is in fact real, right? So if people think a stereotype is real, they're going to act and interact based on what they think is real, right? So we're going to have interactions based on that. And so we can't discount that either, right? That's still really important, right? But I'm glad you said what you said, because that's a reality that I don't think most people know about Civil War reenactors. Okay, over here. I liked it. I did. Well, wait a minute. I should say this. I liked as much as I saw, because I started watching it and I got sidetracked. I was in my formative years in the 80s, and so I, saw the first Candyman too, which I liked, right? I liked a lot, but this second one, I can't remember how far I got, 45 minutes into it, I think. It was clearly going in the direction that the first Candyman was trying to go, but nobody was going to have it. When it was released, nobody was going to go to a film that had overt social messages about race intersected with horror. They weren't. So I know that that's why they changed. Because in fact, apparently the first cut of the film was very much, Racecraft. But then somebody got in the screening room and was like, oh, hell no, nobody's going to go see this, right? Now, though, which is what they did with this new Candyman, is they went right for it. And so as far as I've seen, I like. Well, they've always existed, but people are watching now. People are watching, they're paying attention. How many of you have seen the series Watchmen on HBO? Okay, so a lot of you had. How many of you knew about the Tulsa massacre before you saw? So less than half of you, right? So here's what happened. So for those of you who have not seen Watchmen on HBO, what are you waiting for? I don't know what you're doing with your life. But the very first, wait, let me back up. It is in a world that was created by Alan Moore in comic books. It was a comic book series in the 80s. Literally changed the trajectory of comic books. It's literature, really is. It's political literature. So Watchmen, the series, is based in that world. The very first scene in the film, the first 5 minutes of the first episode, is about the Tulsa massacre. Okay? And I didn't even know that that's what, so I turned, because I'm waiting, and I turn and I'm like, what the, did I thought I missed the time. I was like, did they put another show on? I was about to get really mad. I turned the channel, I came back, nope, that's right. And then I watched for, another minute or so, and I was like, oh, okay. All right. So let me tell you what happened prior to that. When you go to Google Analytics, right, the searches for Tulsa race massacre, very low. Like, I don't know, like maybe 2% of searches on Google. 30 minutes after the premiere of the first episode of Watchmen, the graph spikes. Like, it goes up thousands of percent, right? And it stays there for about a week, right? And then it goes down. That's just for the United States. It also, but you can see the same thing in international Google searches, right? So people know now, right? And a lot of the traffic that we heard, that I read about that first episode was people were angry. Why the hell didn't I know about this? This is a thing that should have been taught in schools. It was the first time that the United States military dropped bombs on civilians in the contiguous United States, right? So one of the reasons we're seeing so much more is because of the fact that now we want to know more. People are really angry that they haven't known a lot of our history, and now they want those gaps to be filled in. And there are some people who are already positioned to do that. You know, Spike Lee is one of those people, Cassie Lemons, you know, et cetera. But that means that there are other people who are waiting in the wings, you know, who are going to be moved up to the front because they can do that. So that I think it's demand, really, honestly, just as simple as that. People are willing to listen now. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm not sure, and here's why I'm not sure. Because I'm not sure if we're picking up on these other pieces of media because we're getting the message, or if we're just doing it because it was good over there and we think it can be good over here. I'm not sure about that because, really, truthfully, I'm just being honest here. There are very few British to American shows that wound up good. Usually when we remake somebody else's, we just crap all over it. One of the exceptions is House of Cards. House of Cards Britain, great. House of Cards US, great. Well, I mean, mostly, except for at the end there. But I think that's what. Now, I also think that part of it is that those themes do matter to us. They do. Look, one of the reasons people love Squid Game is because its primary focus is debt. And we are all talking about that right now, right? I'm in a couple of groups on Facebook that are about student loan debt, which is just fucking egregious, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons we've latched on to Squid Game. That and the fact that, these people will kill us if we don't pay our debt, this kind of idea of this. And then we've kind of got this Hunger Games mentality, the rich people. I mean, Jeff Bezos went to space on a dick, and we all are like, yay, right? While people are starving, kids are in cages, et cetera. And so I think that part of the reason that we're doing it is because of the zeitgeist of it all, right? We're just in the middle of it at this moment. I'm scared about Train to Busan. First of all, we don't have a rail system in this country. How the hell are we gonna make a horror film about a rail? There's no rail. What? So what are they gonna do? Yeah, that part is scary. You're right. But so I think that's why. I think a lot of these shows capture the zeitgeist of our times, and we want to remake them with, faces of U.S. people because we think that, nobody's going to watch, a Korean film with a bunch of Korean folks and, read and or dub. And as a matter of fact, we do. So, but that's what I think it is. Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. Go ahead. Good. Uh-huh. Yeah, those are always the people who complain online, right? Yeah. It's weird, too, because Watchmen is political. I mean, that's all it is. So, but then let's go back to the statement about the Civil War reenactors, right? So the people who actually read Watchmen understood that it was a political piece, right? And it was a complex political piece, right? Just like people who do Civil War enactments are historians, right? But the people on the outside, well, I'm just going to watch the show, don't know anything about that. This is one of the, you know how, I am one of those people. I don't do it in the movie theater, but I wind up doing it later. When I go see a superhero movie that's based on an actual comic, I'm doing the comparison. Right? And I'm that annoying person who after the movie says, you know, it wasn't like that in the comic book, right? I think that's exactly what this is. You know, there are people who go and I'm not gonna take the time to read about it, I'm just gonna watch. And then there are people who kind of study it, and I mean, I did that with Dune, right? Same thing. So I think that's it. Dune is another one that, you know, I think, well, I mean, Denis Villeneuve is a fantastic director, but he also was able to capture the messages of Dune because those messages are also part of the zeitgeist. So, yeah, I agree. Okay, so we're gonna stop right there so we can go on to watch Ganja Hess. Now, Ganja Hess is different in terms of its audience, in terms of its tone, in terms of its audience, in terms of its messaging. So when you watch it with that in mind, right? Now we're watching something that's different than what we saw in Antebellum. The other thing I just found out is that Spike Lee actually did a remake of Ganja Hess, which I have not seen, so I'll be looking for that later. But thank you all for engaging and asking questions, and we'll talk again after Ganja Hess.